All right, so moving on here to the final part of our lecture, we're going to talk about Jane Austen, who you probably know best of any of our authors from this lecture. She's quite famous. Why is she famous? I would argue she invented the modern novel, like with Wollstonecraft and feminism, Scott with the historical novel, Coleridge with the Gothic. Austen was certainly not the first person to write a novel, but her style of novel, when she was writing the early 19th century, she was writing the first novel of a certain type that marked a transition, I would argue, from before Jane Austen, you had a few people writing novels, not very many. After Jane Austen, about 20 years after her, there becomes a mass readership when the middle, lower, and working classes get education. What do they want to read? Novels. But the style of novel they love reading, I believe, was invented by Jane Austen. And I believe it really still informs the type of novel we read today. The novel, compared to poetry and drama, is very much an invention of the modern world. Um, with one or two exceptions, the earliest novels were right before Romanticism. And Romanticism, in so many ways, the cultural factors from the time, the Industrial Revolution, in so many ways, Romanticism really marks, in my opinion, the transition to a modern world. And with it, the emergence of the novel as a popular form, Jane Austen, key to its emergence as a popular form. Um, what a lot of people don't know about Austen is that she lived a very short, secluded life. She didn't, her novels have these big social gatherings. There's Jane Austen theme parks now, but her life was not in the limelight, and it was short. And most of it was in Hampshire, a rural area of southern England where she was born. So she did travel some, but not much. Most of her life was in the small rural area where she grew up, which I find really interesting. She's so famous today. Um, Her formal education was limited to a short time at boarding school, which was true for many of the women at the time, going back to the issues Wollstonecraft raised. But she had a really knowledgeable father, and her sister Cassandra really taught themselves by reading the books from the collection he had in his massive library. Um, One thing people always point out about Austen is that in 1802 she turned down a marriage proposal. No one really knows the true reasons for this. They even made movies about it with James McAvoy, kind of put him on the map as an actor. The textbook argues that she really wanted to be an author, which is certainly true. At this point, she'd been writing since she was 11, and she's almost 30 here, so she's been writing for close to 20 years, and had already started sending work off to publishers. I don't think she'd had much of it accepted yet. She soon would. So perhaps she anticipated the difficulty of balancing being an author with being a wife and mother. And then at that time, she would have been what we call a gentry hostess. In other words, she was part of the landed gentry, the upper class in the rural part of society. And if she married into that gentry and stayed in that gentry class, and by accepting this proposal, she would have been playing hostess quite a bit to these upper class people and wouldn't have had much free time to write. So I mean, it's a very good reason, but we don't know. We can't put ourselves in Jane Austen's mind. So I like to keep my mind open to as many possibilities as to the answer to this question as possible. And if you want to propose one, I'd love to hear it. She began writing at the age of 12. She wrote what we call juvenilia, which just means fiction she wrote when she was a juvenile or a young person. And she would read her stories to her family, but Austen was someone, as the bullet point prior to this mentions, just really loved writing, just really wanted to be an authoress. And so she did it from an incredibly young age and just loved doing it. Um, Her name was never publicly attached to her novels. They never said Austen. They just said a lady. So people did know it was a female author, which is important. But like Walter Scott, she became so popular once she got going and Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice came out. she became quite popular. Basically, everyone knew she was writing these novels, even though her name wasn't on them. Finally, as I said before, she really set the precedent for the modern novel. What is that? I kept saying she wrote a type of novel that marked the transition from a pre-modern time where the novel didn't exist or wasn't popular to a modern time where the novel is the most popular form. What type of novel is that? I would argue it's both character and narrative driven, with an emphasis on economics and marriage. So, in other words, you have a plot where a young person or several young people are at an age where they're about to get married, and finances, family connections, and relationships drive that. You might be saying, I haven't read a lot of novels quite like that. Well, the Victorian period, which we'll start studying in 2 lessons, immediately followed this time, and almost every Victorian novel followed that plot line I just described. So she's certainly a precursor to the Victorian novel. And the Victorian period is when the novel became popular, when it rose to prominence. But I would argue the novels we read today are still similar to this, even if they don't have quite that plot. I think that the character and narrative driven, which is important. The novels before this were very episodic. You would think they'd always been plot and narrative driven, but with the exception of Walter Scott and Edgeworth, prior to Austen, you only really had novels like Robinson Crusoe, which was kind of an adventure novel, very limited characters, not much plot. Um, you also had satirical novels that were basically just satires. So what Austen did was she created a type of novel where you have a character you're invested in from the very beginning and a number of conflicts that come into that character's life. In this case, economics and the need to marriage, but that can translate to other conflicts for other times and cultures. So you have, character conflict in a story that unfolds, and as that story unfolds, the character grows and changes until you have this resolution. You become very invested in the character. That seems obvious, but in terms of it being the structure of a novel, that really wasn't around before Austen. That's not the case in Robinson Crusoe. She really set the precedent for this modern form, and she's got so many great reasons why she should study her, but that alone is a big one. So, like with Walter Scott, I'm going to look at some themes of her canon in general, of her major novels, and try to connect this very short story to those themes. But what we have here in the Norton Anthology is a story she wrote when she was a teenager. You can certainly see some similarities to her most famous novels if you've read them. And you can see kind of the genesis of the ideas that drive her novels and have made her famous, but they're not quite fully formed yet. So we will look closely at the story, but we'll also look at the themes in it that appear in her other novels and how she's perhaps developed those themes, taken them a step further, trying to give you've read this story, so you have a good idea of what Austen is like, but you may have read her novel since she's so popular, but if you haven't, I'm going to then try to build on what you've read with this short story and give you a characterization of what she was like as a novelist. Because, as I said, that's so important to understanding the novels we read today, as well as what she accomplished at the time. So there's a confidence in the narrative voice. If you've read Pride and Prejudice, which is her most famous novel, it opens with, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a young man with a good fortune must be in want of a wife." So she speaks like an authoritative voice. Um, she may be questioning, challenging assumptions, but she speaks like she knows the truth. And that's a very ironic opening to Pride and Prejudice, because what she does, one of the main things she does throughout all of her fiction, is challenge the idea of marrying for money. So there you have it. She has this very witty, ironic, satirical, confident narrative voice. In her own words, she described her novels as pictures of domestic life in country villages, which is true. That's what they depict. And they are very um, specifically focused. I have had students, when I've taught Austen in the past, complain to me that her works do not have universal or big enough themes. But I think those are people who, for whatever reason, I don't understand it, don't like Austen. Because if you look deeper, I think she does deal with those universal themes, even if the setting is very, in many of the concerns, very specific. What are those bigger themes? Well, as we've talked about all throughout this course so far, this was a time of revolution, war, and economic change. The sweeping changes that Scott dealt with. Austen's dealing with those too. But just like Scott was dealing with it in the borderlands, she's dealing with it in the culture and the class she knew. So she comes from this upper class rural society, the landed gentry. And those that society really had certain beliefs about what it meant to be a gentleman and what it meant to be a gentlewoman, and so much so that there were even books or novels of manners written about what it meant to be a gentleman and a gentlewoman. And so that was experiencing a change with the industrial revolution. The rural economy changed, and the estates on which the landed gentry lived no longer produced um, resources that were as valuable as the resources being produced in the markets in the industrial cities. And so the landed gentry, much like Scots Highlanders, although very different, were a class of society that were soon to disappear. And so Austen, like Scott, is dealing with sweeping changes. On one level, they're specific to her class, the landed gentry, but at the same time, society at large is dealing with sweeping changes. So there's also, despite the local specific emphasis, there's a universal appeal to how Austen approaches dealing with those sweeping changes. So, how does she combat those changes? We've seen how Scott does it with music and the celebration of the past. How does Austen deal with the sweeping changes? Well, for one, she explored the form of the novel. As I mentioned, she was writing a new type, a new style of novel that eventually became the precedent. And so, a couple of things she does in her style of writing is present a romantic point of view, but she's also very ironic and looks at the limits of romance. Why romance? Well, again, it was the Romantic period, and people were fascinated with this revival of the medieval romances, but also in her society, among the landed gentry, marriage and economics were crucial. Um, People wanted to find a good match for their children. In what way was the match good or advantageous? In that they were also married to a class of people from this high class, high stature, this landed upper class, and so there wasn't much freedom for people in who they married, and so romance was very limited in that sense. But Austen really wanted to understand and define romance, and so her exploration of what romance truly is one way of dealing with these sweeping changes. This landed class that has worked these prearranged marriages for centuries to maintain their position is about to lose their position in an industrializing, changing economy. And so, it truly exploring what romance really means in the face of that change is one way Austen combats it. She was against pictures of perfection. So her novels have these witty, satirical, ironic narrators that we've already talked about, but she didn't want her works to have perfect marital bliss. Um, the best couples in her novels are still ones with imperfections. Um, there's not just, this perfect, everyone's happy portrait. That doesn't happen. So these are some of the major themes of her novels in general. She wrote 6 novels. Let's look more specifically at the short story we read. So it's called Love and Friendship, and I love the subtitle. You see the irony, the satire right there. Love and Friendship, a novel of letters deceived in friendship, and betrayed in love. So she immediately takes the two qualities from the title and critiques them. I just love it. Um, so it's a satirical critique of how romantic stories at the time presented love and friendship. So these are the two things going on. The protagonist, Laura, experiences love. She gets married. And friendship. She makes this Sophia this friend. And um, neither of those are ideal relationships, mainly because they happen too quickly. And so some of the novels that did exist at the day were these romance novels that were not um, deep thought-provoking works. They were very generic romance stories, and part of the reason why people saw novels as lowbrow. And so Austen wanted to challenge that because one of the things they depicted was love at first sight and friendships that form too quickly. So Austen said, it's not a good idea. You need to take time, get to know a person, trust a person. And she does that through this story, which is ultimately, I would argue, a tragic story. It doesn't turn out well for Laura to marry someone after love at first sight and to make a friend really quickly. What are some other themes of this short story? Sensibility. You're probably familiar with her novel Sense and Sensibility. Sensibility is not a term we use a lot today, but it was very popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it was responsiveness toward emotions of another. So, feelings, how much people experience feelings, especially their empathy for the feelings of someone else. And it's an idea Austen critiques. As much as the Romantic period was a time of spontaneity and imagination and feeling, Austen was iconoclastic, even with the revolutionary thinkers of her day. In that she certainly does not reject sensibility and emotions, but downplays or critiques their significance. They can be emphasized too much. In Sense and Sensibility, Marianne Dashwood makes damaging choices based on her emotions and feelings, and Laura does in this story as well. Um, Finally, I want to mention the fainting spells before we look at some quotes. Um, it became very cliche, especially in the romance stories of the day, to have female characters just faint whenever something dramatic happens. And Austen wanted to critique it. There were stereotypes of women as overdramatic, melodramatic individuals, and she wanted to challenge that. So, how did she do it? By putting so much fainting into this short story that it almost becomes or does become ridiculous. And so, this romance stories of her day had a lot of fainting. She puts even more to point out how ridiculous this is. Did it actually happen? Yes. Did it have to do with romance? Probably more to serious mental health issues. Did it happen nearly as much as it does in her story and the other stories of the day? Not at all. So she's critiquing this depiction of women as overly emotional here. All right, let's look at some quotes. Um, in the opening letter, her friend Isabel, that's asking Laura to write to her daughter Marianne, in her request says, if a woman may ever be said to be in safety from, here's the important part, determined perseverance of disagreeable lovers and the cruel persecutions of obstinate fathers, surely it must be at such a time of life. So Laura is 55 years old here, and her friend believes she's old enough that she's free from these two things, lovers and fathers, basically, and can write to her daughter and explain the tragic story of her life. So this is really important because these two relationships, to lovers and to fathers, are important throughout all of Austen's work. Austen was very close with her father, and Pride and Prejudice and Emma and Persuasion, you have characters who are very close to their fathers. And in Pride and Prejudice, it's a good, loving relationship, very similar to the one Austen had with her own father. In Emma and Persuasion, the characters love their fathers, and their fathers love them, but their fathers are not great people, and are much of their demands and their issues are very much the driving force of the conflict of those novels. And you see that here in this story with people rebelling against their parents. And in another novel, Sense and Sensibility, you see the results of not having a father present. And then Lovers is the other part of the equation here. So obviously, Austen focuses on this. All of her novels deal with marriage and choosing a partner. And so you see, the negative effects of love at first sight here. And so um, one critic argues that through these relationships, Austen critiques stereotypical female behavior of her day. And again, I think the stereotypical behavior this critic's talking about is marrying too quickly, making rash decisions, giving in to the impulse of love at first sight. Um, but she really explores these spouse relationship or parent relationship. Those are some of they're the most complex relationships we experience in our lives, and Austen really delves into those complexities and into the psychology of those relationships, and that's part of why she has such great writing. um, this next quote is a long one, but I really think it encapsulates this story in Austen's work quite well. A sensibility too trembling alive to every affliction of my friends, my acquaintances, and particularly to every affliction of my own, was my only fault, if a fault it could be called. Alas, how altered now! Though indeed my own misfortunes do not make less impression on me than they ever did, yet now I never feel for those of another. My accomplishments too begin to fade. I can neither sing so well nor dance so gracefully as I once did. So, what you have here is the protagonist looking back at her life with perhaps remorse and saying she had too much sensibility when she was younger. And so, this is perhaps one of the parts of the story that's actually not ironic because it's when she's older looking back. And then this is before we really get the narrative. Both of these quotes are early. So, you have this setup with this very authentic statement, and then you have the telling of the story, and it's all ironic in order to illustrate this statement. So this statement, in one sense, is like the thesis of the story. Um, and basically, she felt too much. She was too alive to the afflictions of her friends that she didn't make the best choices. She made these spontaneous, ultimately tragic choices because of her sensibility toward her friend, Sophia. But she also says, my own affliction. So she gives into her own emotions and sensibility quite often. And that also has negative results, certainly in her marriage, which happens very quickly. So, what did we learn? Um, Her tone here is melancholy in that last quote. The part that really stuck with me is it says, her misfortunes seem to stick, her misfortunes are still with her, but her accomplishments are starting to fade, is what it says. And so the bad things from her youth are lasting in her old age and she still remembers them, but the good things she's starting to forget. That's a really tragic ending, if you ask me. And she says it at the beginning, but this is a story told through letters, and it's a story where she's looking back at her youth, and so we really get the ending in the beginning, and it's quite tragic. So why have that? Well, she's critiquing, like I said on the last slide, those stereotypical behaviors of the day: love at first sight, friendship at first sight, and being too immediately trusting. But what do we make this tragic ending? A couple things. One, well, really just underscoring that it's tragic because, like Scott, music is important. She says she's no longer able to sing and dance. In contrast to Scott, the old minstrel is able to sing and dance, and we have this redemptive, heroic ending. Here we have this tragic ending because she can't sing and dance. So we get the reverse result, but the idea is the same. And so music was very important to the Romantic authors. But what comes of this tragedy? Well, it's not all tragic. What Austen does is the majority of the story, 12 out of the 15 letters, recount Laura's life after she set it up with this kind of tragic introduction. And it's very, very funny. I was laughing out loud when I was reading it at points because it's ironic. She's making fun of everything that happens. And so she intertwines humor with tragedy. And this is really a hallmark of her writing. Her stories often have tragic elements, but they're so funny and entertaining that in a way it makes the tragedy bearable. And that's a great comment on life and really a comment on why she's popular and how, like all of these authors we've looked at, most of them, Scott, Coleridge, and now Austen, were all dealing with the sweeping changes of the day. That could be our theme for this lesson. And how did they respond? They each proposed a strategy. Scott celebrated the culture of the past. Coleridge taught this moral lesson about universal connection. Austen is helping us laugh. Um, Sometimes things are so tragic you have to laugh at them. Humor is necessary for survival. Austen understood that and brought that to her novels well. Finally, if we were to read her canon, her novels, we would see how she takes the ideas from this story she wrote when she was a teenager much farther. Here we see the tragic results of marrying too soon. We see those tragic results in her later novels, but what they often have, almost all of her novels have, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Emma, what they have is character, an important character, but not a main character, who gets married too young and has tragic results. But then we have these minor characters that are the Laura type characters. But then what we have is a main character who does marry well and it does have a happy ending, but it really explores what it means to what is true love? What is a desirable marriage? It's not the marriage your parents arrange because they want to carry on the traditions of the landed gentry. It's where you find an equal partner. And so you have in Sense and Sensibility is Eleanor Dashwood with Edward Ferrars. In Pride and Prejudice, you have um, Elizabeth with Darcy. And then in Emma, which I think is the best example, those other two may be more famous, but I think Emma is the best example with Emma and Mr. Knightley. Emma, or if you've seen the movie Clueless, is this arrogant character who actually plays matchmaker and sets some of her friends up in bad marriages. But she's beautiful, she's intelligent, um, but she's so intelligent and so clever. She's almost too clever for her own good. And she tries to match people up, including herself, and it does not go well. But then you have Mr. Knightley, her foil, her counterpoint, and he's equally intelligent. He's the only person who can really challenge her. And so what she finds is, I'm spoiling the ending of Emma, I'm sorry, but what she finds is a person she's known all her life ends up being the best match because he's the only one who can truly be an equal with her based on the qualities they both have. And so her marriage to Mr. Knightley is not the one that society would dictate. She's tried to reason that for herself and tried to marry who it seems like the logical choice based on society's prescribed values, and that doesn't work out. But she finds an intellectual, witty equal in Mr. Knightley, and so you really have a happier ending in these later novels that kind of continue the idea here, but in addition to the tragedy, provide a counterpoint of what is a good marriage partner. And contrary to this story, it doesn't happen at first sight. And Emma, it takes her whole life. She's known Mr. Knightley longer than any of the characters, and she doesn't figure it out until she experiences some tragedy. So it's a slow process, is the key difference. And then her other two, she has 6 novels. Northanger Abbey is a Gothic satire, but of her 5 most well-known novels, the other two I haven't mentioned, Mansfield Park and Persuasion, are a little bit closer to tragedy. I talked about how she didn't want to paint perfect pictures, and the marriages, the good marriages in the 3 novels I've discussed so far, they're not perfect. There will be conflict, there will be issues because no marriage is perfect. Every marriage takes work. Um, so they're never perfect portraits, but they are happy. They are the kind of marriage one should strive for. But in Mansfield Park and Persuasion, her other 2 novels, they're not quite that good. There's still some tragedy. You think maybe these aren't the most perfect marriages. And that's another way to illustrate her point about what true love should be. So, with these stories, these novels of Austen, where you have a protagonist, you have a conflict, and you have a complex, engaging narrative that works out that conflict and illustrates the growth of the protagonist, you have the invention of the modern novel.